So it's going to be up to voters to vote in local elected officials who run your elections, who actually care about the sanctity of your vote, who actually believe in that credo of one person, one vote, and they want your vote to count. Because any illegal vote that's counted, if there's a double vote that's counted, if there's a vote by an illegal alien that's counted, if there's a dead person that's voted, if they vote for a candidate that's the opposite of who you voted for, they're effectively canceling your vote out. They're canceling your voice. You know, this is a constitutional republic, and we should be able to have a high degree of confidence that everybody's vote counts, everybody's vote matters. That's what this issue is all about. You know, we should be able to know that when we go to those polls that we're participating in a fair, transparent process. And right now, nobody in this country has that safeguard.
Just how big an issue is voter fraud in America? And how does it happen despite the safeguards? What exactly are ghost voters? And how does ballot harvesting actually work? And in the eyes of Adrian Norman, what policies need to be put in place to ensure free and fair elections in America? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jekielek. In this episode, we'll sit down with Adrian Norman, a political commentator who is also an opinion contributor for the Epoch Times. His new book is titled The Art of the Steal, Exposing Fraud and Vulnerabilities in America's Elections. Adrian Norman, so wonderful to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks for having me.
Adrian, you know, you've written The Art of the Steal. It's a pretty fascinating book on a topic which is very important to me, election interference, voter fraud, and I think you've tried to come up with a kind of a comprehensive picture of those realities in the U.S.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's an important issue. It's something I really started getting into during the 2018 midterms, and I was just kind of sitting there like most Americans, watching the results come in, and you start to see these anomalies. And you know, I was looking at Florida in particular, and you would see results of you would see boxes that were being found of ballots that were just left in the back of a car. We'd see that results were supposed to be turned in and counted by 7:30 p.m. election night from mail-in and absentee ballots. The elections supervisor couldn't tell you how many ballots were left to be counted. They didn't have a final tally. It looked like there was a lot of corruption that was involved. So that's kind of what made me take note. I originally started by just taking a bunch of notes. I was going to write a series of op-eds about it.
Okay.
And it ended up just kind of taking on a life of its own. And I had so much content on that. And then I dug into some other issues as well and decided to go ahead and pursue a book at that point.
What did you find? How big an issue is this? I'm hearing all sorts of stories. Some people say it's a massive deal, and other people are saying this is sort of insignificant to the actual realities of the outcomes of the elections.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, man. If you ask somebody on the political left, they typically tell you that there's no widespread evidence of voter fraud. If you ask somebody on the political right, they say it's out of control. The fact of the matter is, it is a significant problem because it is something that's happening across the country. And a lot of people don't seem to be concerned with it because they think it happens in such small numbers it can't really have an impact on an election.
Okay.
But when we look at the data, what we find is that a lot of times elections are decided by margins that are smaller than the number of ghost voters, which would be like the number of over registrations. And that could be dead voters, that could be fraud with absentee ballots, that's being contributing to increasing a vote tally illegally. So let me give you a couple examples. Dan Crenshaw's election in Texas was by a margin that was smaller than the number of ghost voters that Texas has. In the 2016 election, there were multiple states that Hillary Clinton won by margins that were smaller than the number of over registrations on those voter rolls. There were a couple states that President Trump won by margins that were smaller than the number of over registrations. So again, across the entire country, we have numerous races, not even just congressional or presidential races, but for local elections, where the potential for fraud and the potential for corruption is significant, not necessarily because there's 10 million people who are casting fraudulent ballots, but because a local race might only be decided by 100 votes. It doesn't take a lot to swing that type of election. And, you know, we place a lot of importance in this country right now on national races, and I think the social media and the media cycle has a lot to do with that. But a lot of the decision making that takes place that affects most people's lives actually happens at the local level. It happens at the regional level. So your Secretary of State, you know, your school board, your county recorder, you know, those are positions that impact most people on a daily basis far more than the President of the United States will, far more than a congressman or a senator. And those are the races that are decided by those tight margins, and those are the things that ultimately have an impact on national elections. But if you could flip one of those local races with just a few hundred votes, we know those sorts of things are possible. Because one of the other things that I address in the book is that, you know, we have statements from political operatives who readily admit that their counterparts are sitting around filling out absentee ballots by the hundreds or the thousands, specifically for the purpose of swinging elections.
Their counterparts, meaning?
So a political operative is saying that somebody else who's working in politics
On the other side.
potentially, yeah,
Okay.
is, you know, sitting around filling out absentee ballots, and, you know, that's what they're submitting. And, you know, we have people on record saying, people who run elections on record saying, you know, we get a box of 1,000 votes that show up. We have no idea where these ballots came from, but they just get counted toward the official vote tallies. So how is that possible in a free and fair system? You know, how can we say one person, one vote when you can just have a box of ballots show up that goes toward a tally? There's no chain of custody. You have no idea who filled them out. We're not, in many cases, able to authenticate that the person's name on the ballot is who actually completed it. To put a finer point on it, I mean, we have...
I see, and of course, and we can't ask them, you know, what did you do? We can't ask them that question. So we just, once they're there, the ballot's there, it's there. And you either reject it or you use it, but you can't really ask someone, did you fill this out this way?
Right. Well, some are rejected. Some ballots are rejected when signatures have mismatches. But again, something that we've seen nationwide is that oftentimes when signatures don't match, they still just accept the ballot.
What are ghost voters? You mentioned that a little bit earlier, and I think that might be a little bit of a term that not a lot of us don't know. Like, can you break that down?
Yeah, so let me give you an example. So across the U.S., we have 248 counties, I believe, that have more registered voters than they have living voters living people of voting age.
Okay.
So those extra voters on the voter rolls, it's just a slang term referring to those particular...
Everybody who certainly isn't real, I guess. Okay.
Exactly.
So I guess you could be dead. I've heard that there's a lot of people that have passed on that are on voter rolls.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? Voting from the grave. I'm not sure how they do it. It's a neat trick. But no, yeah, there are around 2 million people who are deceased.
Nationwide?
Yeah, and have not only been registered to vote, but have been recorded casting ballots in multiple elections since they've passed on. I'm going to give you one example on this. And there was a CBS reporter who was talking about the Democratic machine in Chicago. And what they were doing is actually going into cemeteries, taking names off tombstones, registering people to vote who were dead, and then actually casting ballots in those people's names. So a lot of times, even if you purge names from voter rolls, if this kind of activity is taking place, it's real difficult to interdict fraud if those names are just getting back on the voter rolls that easy. But yeah, there are a ton of dead voters, but that's one of the means that are used to do it, is nasty and sordid as that is. I mean, it's kind of despicable to go through cemeteries just to try to win an election.
Wow, that's a big deal. So did they get stopped in the end, this group, or what happens in this sort of situation? Do people go to jail?
There are prosecutions for voter fraud. The Heritage Foundation actually has a database where they keep track of a lot of this stuff, but there's nowhere near the prosecutions that there should be, just because it's expensive and police have to focus their time on real crimes like assaults, rapes, murders. They don't have the appetite or necessarily the funding to pursue voter fraud. It's just not a high priority. It's not a high priority item.
I see. So in the situation of lack of enforcement, There's just a lot of opportunity, I guess. That's what you found, or is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, overall, there's a lack of enforcement. Yeah, and that's something that facilitates it. If you're able to get away with it, and there's a reasonable chance you're not going to get caught, what's your deterrent? Now, there are cases where there have been some high-profile cases where people have been caught. There was an NAACP official from Mississippi, Lisa Della Sowers. She was caught voting. I can't remember if it was 2008 or 2012, or 2008, excuse me, or 2012. But she voted 10 times in a single election. She got arrested. She was charged. She was convicted and got 5 years per count, but the judge let her serve the sentences concurrently. To contrast that, there were officials in Florida, shocker, in 2018. There were 3 officials in particular. It was a local race. And questions were raised after the election because all 3 won their races because of an unusually high number of absentee ballots that were cast. So they found that what they did was they ordered absentee ballots in their constituents' names. In some cases, they actually completed those ballots for the constituents.
Okay.
In other cases, they delivered the ballots to their constituents' homes and stood there while they filled them out, so they sort of helped them fill out their ballots. The investigation found, I think, 2,000 instances of forgery. And despite all of this evidence that the fraud was committed, and these are jailable offenses, detectives declined to even interview them and pursue the case. There were no charges, there was no real investigation.
Amazing. So how many other types of the ghost voters are there? So there's these deceased people, how else are people on rolls, in these sort of inflated roles?
Dead voters is one way that people end up on voter rolls erroneously. The other would be if you simply move out of state, just a change of address. It's real simple.
So then there's duplication. You'd be on 2 voter rolls at the same time.
Right. Duplicate voter rolls, and there are roughly 3 million people who are registered to vote in multiple states. And if you think it's not an issue, let me kind of paint a picture for you. So, before Barack Obama was elected, the state of North Carolina, which is always a hotbed of controversy for election fraud.
Okay.
Now, Barack Obama carried North Carolina by about 15,000 votes. North Carolina also was found during that time had about 100,000 people who were registered to vote in multiple states. 35,000 people actually voted in multiple states during that time. And when they looked at those records, those 35,000 people represented only checking their voter registration database against 28 other states. They didn't check it against all 49. So there actually could have been far more people who voted 2, 3, 4, or 5 more times. We'll never know. But this is what I'm talking about in this book. That fraud is real. That fraud is documented. Why it wasn't pursued, I have no idea. Okay. That's on record. But it's the insecurity that we have in our system of not knowing exactly how much fraud is out there and exactly how many double votes are being cast, for instance. And to me, the important issue and the takeaway is that we've got to start instituting policies. We've got to start taking steps to secure our elections and close these loopholes to make it impossible for an illegal vote to be cast in the first place. And then we don't have to worry about this. This should just be a non-issue.
So you've obviously given a lot of thought to this, right? What are some of the quickest, easiest ways? Because there's a lot of battles that are ongoing, right? Like with the Electoral Commission that the president had created a couple of years back. A lot of battles going on with respect to trying to deal with this issue, because there's also this question of voter suppression, right? And we definitely don't want to create a scenario where people that should be able to vote aren't able to, right? How does this all play out in your mind based on what you've learned?
So to directly answer your question, one of the easiest ways that we can go about addressing this issue is to require an ID to vote, voter ID. But we have to get away from just accepting a driver's license or a state ID, because as we've seen recently, the state of New York just started issuing driver's licenses to illegal aliens. Now, a lot of people freaked out on social media. I saw the Twitter comments that day. The Hill posted a video online showing a line of people wrapped around the building at the New York DMV down the street. It's not really an issue in that instance in a state like New York because they don't have an ID requirement to vote anyway. It's a non-issue. California, same way. They already allow illegal aliens to vote in local elections in San Francisco. An ID, giving illegal aliens IDs in those jurisdictions doesn't matter. Same with Illinois. They've been doing it for years. Now, something that I just saw this morning is that the state of New York is now looking to automatically register illegal aliens to vote as they're giving them their licenses. That's the issue. So now they're being registered to vote and having the credentials to do so. So what we need is what I would suggest is a national voter ID card. So basically, a form of ID that only U.S. citizens even possess would be the only acceptable ID to vote in U.S. elections. And we have examples of a system like that that works already. All we have to do is look to our neighbor to the south, Mexico. You know, their system is pretty much airtight. And the Brennan Center released the details on how they built their voter registration list. And down there, you actually, you can't automatically get registered to vote. There's no online registration. You have to show up in person to register. You have to provide a fingerprint. You have to provide a signature. They take your photo. So it's a 3-point authentication process. It's about a 20-day processing time to have the card generated. And when you go to pick it up, you got to show another form of ID just to pick up the voter ID card. A system like that is pretty much airtight, right? No matter what your over registrations are on the voter list, if you're matching whoever's casting that ballot up with that ID, then you know that that's the person who's casting that ballot. That would fix 90% of the issues that we have, if not more. To answer the other part of your question, the reason why that's such a challenge is because anytime measures like that are proposed, you know, you have advocacy groups that love to play the race card. They love to scream voter suppression, racism. They file lawsuits insinuating that any meaningful step toward eliminating election fraud is an attempt to suppress the minority vote. And I give a ton of examples in the book. You see exactly how prevalent this is, not just with voter ID, but any other measure at all that would have the impact of curbing voter fraud.
It seems like the people that are, saying there's going to be voter suppression, they believe that will prevent a lot of people from voting, right? That can otherwise do so now, right? What is the argument, and why do you think it's not a good argument?
The argument is that by instituting voter ID laws, or one of the other issues is restricting early voting to a certain number of days. The talking point is that it's going to disenfranchise Black and brown voters. Disproportionately, right. What we found over the years is that the statistics don't justify that. We've looked at the data in states that have instituted voter ID policies, and what we've actually found is the opposite. In most states, voter turnout is actually higher.
Even among the minority communities?
I'm talking specifically about minority communities. So Black and brown voters turn out at a higher rate, even in states where voter ID laws have been instituted.
Fascinating.
And furthermore, if this is really, really an issue, all you got to do is ask those communities themselves. And I think Pew has already done that. And we found that 77% of African American voters support voter ID laws. 77% of Hispanic Americans support voter ID laws. 80% of Americans across the country support voter ID laws. This should be a non-issue. So the question is, how does a majority of the country, again, support these reasonable policies that we know have about a 90% chance of stopping all of the corruption that we're looking at, and still no action is being taken politically? We still have lawsuits being filed by the ACLU. We still have lawsuits filed by the NAACP. What's the real objective? If we know these policies are going to work, and we know that there's no real suppressive effect of these policies, then what's the real end goal? It's a clear sign that something else is going on. There are some people who benefit from voter fraud. There are people who benefit from the system the way it is right now. They don't want it to change. And that's the reason that you see so many loopholes that are allowed to persist in this system.
I see. Something that just comes to mind immediately as you're discussing this is ballot harvesting. this concept. You described that. You discuss this extensively in the book. It's something that's become legal in California. Can you tell me a little bit? People here have heard about ballot harvesting, but a lot of people don't really understand what it is and how it plays out.
Yeah, so ballot harvesting is a process where a voter casts an absentee or mail-in ballot, and then rather than turning it in themselves, a political operative will go to their house and pick that ballot up and turn it in for them. So as you can imagine, obviously this creates the potential for immense fraud. A couple things could happen. The ballot harvester could pick up a ballot and just turn it in. A ballot harvester could pick up your ballot, and let's just say that they know that your household tends to vote or is registered to the opposing party. They could pick up your ballot and toss your ballot in a dumpster. There's no real chain of custody, so they're not going to get caught. So your vote just went out the window there. They could open up the ballot and alter the votes. Or, and this also happens, they could actually accept a blank ballot, have you sign it, and complete the entire ballot for you for whatever candidates they want and turn it in. So ballot harvesting, while it's sold as a policy that creates an additional layer of convenience, it also introduces an additional layer of insecurity and potential for fraud in our elections for those reasons.
Interesting. So, because ballot harvesting, it's also really important in a way because people have argued that in California, a number of races kind of changed because of these absentee ballots coming in after the election, and that the new ballot harvesting laws were responsible for this. Couldn't everybody play this game, the ballot harvesting game of going around trying to just solicit more of these ballots from people who otherwise can't be bothered to go and vote?
Oh, agreed. So in 2016, California, you referenced to California, they passed their ballot harvesting law in 2016, right before the Clinton-Trump matchup. The way it was done, the GOP didn't even have a heads up. Their legislature passed this. They knew that they were going to pass this bill. They had their ground game already worked out. They had their assets ready. They were ready to roll as soon as this thing was passed, and they had their local machinery already built out. Now, ballot harvesting is legal in California. It did manage to flip, at least 3 races because Republicans had 3 candidates who were up on election night, only to days and weeks after that election was over, have those leads completely wiped out. Epoch Times actually ran a great piece on this right after the election, talking about how those seats were flipped. In a free and fair system, we shouldn't have to worry about that. However, in California, ballot harvesting is legal, and I think what the GOP should have been doing, and I think what they have been doing in California, is building out their own ground game. And yes, I think in the 2020 election, we can expect to see Republicans taking advantage of the exact same loopholes that Democrats have taken advantage of. I'm not sure that's a good thing, though, because again, even though the practice itself is legal, it can be exploited. So we can't necessarily, we don't necessarily know that the results are entirely accurate, because now either side can exploit those loopholes to game the system and put their thumb on the scale and boost their own lead. So if we really want to build out a system, again, that's about free and fair elections, in my opinion, ballot harvesting needs to be relegated to the ash heap of history.
Obviously a very strong policy direction you're advocating for here. What are the other policy directions that you think that you believe, based on what you've learned, would basically eliminate voter ID? You said 90%, but what about other policies in general, and how do we take care of the other 10%?
Good question. Definitely a national voter ID card. Ending ballot harvesting would help immensely. I would say even kind of revamping how we do mail-in and absentee ballots. Because again, without a chain of custody, it just introduces the potential for more fraud. As far as electronic voting, 0 mobile or internet voting at this time. There's research from a lot of places that shows that even with the advances that we've had in technology, that right now there's not a platform on earth that is able to secure an internet voting platform. So whether it's cell phones, whether it's being from computing, until additional steps are taken to be able to secure those types of systems, kind of a moratorium on that. And I think West Virginia is the only state that's really started to pursue that at this point.
Is that extend to the voting machines, which frankly kind of work the same way, I think, right? Except that they're localized in the polling station.
Well, voting machines don't have as high a risk of being hacked themselves. There are videos we've seen online where people can buy a special card that you insert. It allows you to modify the machine and basically reset it and vote for a candidate as many times as you want. I don't think a lot of people would even have access to that or have the desire to go through the cumbersome process of learning how to do that, but it is somewhat of a vulnerability. It's not really an internet issue. Now, with electronic voting machines, during the tabulation process, they can be hacked. And during the transmission process, when the data is sent, votes could be altered as well. But as far as hacking the actual machine itself and casting an invalid ballot, it's a little tougher, but it's still possible.
So just to be clear, so the voting machines, the ballots get counted sort of in machine and the transmission is subsequent. It's not like you're on a computer that's sending to a central database. Of some sort. Okay.
And in secure electronic voting machines, all we have to do is add a paper trail. So a paper record for every single vote that's cast.
I see.
That way those things can be married.
Verification.
Exactly. And I think Georgia has just pursued a bipartisan resolution to have electronic voting machines that have a paper trail to limit the potential for fraud. And I think that example is something that should be extrapolated across the entire United States as well.
So, okay, so we have voter ID, we have, this example you just gave, we have the elimination of ballot harvesting. Any other policies?
Those would be the big ones. If we could take those basic steps, purging voter rolls as well.
Okay.
There's no reason why.
So how big is what does that mean even? Because again, we hear it. It's this jargon you hear, but
yeah. So let me try to kind of simplify it.
It doesn't. My point is, it doesn't sound good. So why would we advocate for it?
Well,
no,
it depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound good because you're told it disenfranchises people, et cetera. Look, the state, and this has been rectified. I'm gonna circle back to this, so stay with me. In California, San Diego and LA counties just a couple of years ago, just those two counties, had 1.5 million more people registered to vote than people of voting age who lived there. 1.5 million more people that could cast ballots than actual people.
So 1.5 million ghost voters.
Right.
Okay.
That's an obvious problem, right?
Yeah. One would think.
Again, I'm just painting a picture for you. So we're talking about purging voter rolls.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, when we're talking about purging voter rolls, all we're talking about is getting rid of those 1.5 extra names so that whatever your population is that is able to vote, those are the people on your voter rolls. That's it. It's real straightforward. It's real basic. It's real common sense, right?
Purging is you're purging the people that clearly shouldn't be on there.
You're getting rid of the ineligible voters who are showing up on voter rolls. It shouldn't be controversial.
What's stopping this from happening? It just seems like a routine thing you would do bureaucratically, right?
Well, it's also mandated by the National Voter Registration Act of 1994. It's mandated.
Right.
Steps have to be taken. So if you determine, and there are different ways that you can actually determine this, but if you determine that there's an ineligible name on a voter roll, you can't just purge that name from the voter roll. You're required to send them a mailer after they've missed 2 federal elections. So years go by before most people are ever purged. So you got to miss a couple elections. Your local jurisdiction has to send you a mailer advising you that, hey, you haven't voted, your name's going to be purged if you don't respond by such and such a date. Okay. If you fail to do all of those things, at that point, then your name is purged from the voter rolls. So there are still protections in place to make sure, or to limit the possibility of legally registered voters from being kicked off these voter rolls. Now, here's a caveat. A lot of people act like it's the worst thing in the world. What you can do as a voter before any election, I'd say 4 months out, because you can't purge anybody within 90 days of an election. But if you're not sure, if you maybe haven't voted the last election or two, just go to your Secretary of State's website and you can just confirm your registration online. It takes 2 minutes, and that would eliminate 90% of the issues with voter purges. Now, I will say this as well. Between 2014 and 2016, 16 million names were purged from U.S. voter rolls. 95% of the people in the United States have never had an issue. So as far as issues with legally registered voters getting caught up in this and getting to the polls and all of a sudden their name's not on it, it's a very small percentage of the population who ever runs into any kind of issue with this. So yeah, purging voter rolls would definitely be an additional step we should take on a more frequent basis to ensure that only legal U.S. voters are casting votes to elect our elected representatives.
So I've been thinking about this issue as we've been talking of what you said about the states that have instituted voter ID laws, and that there's actually an increase in turnout, especially among minorities and so forth. How do you account for that? Why do you think that happens?
It's difficult to say. I mean, there's so many different factors that could go into determining why somebody does or doesn't show out for a particular race. I'm not saying it's causation. All I'm saying is that the data shows that instituting those policies doesn't have a suppressive effect.
It just strikes me that it could actually give people more confidence that their vote will actually count.
Yeah, that could definitely be a factor. And I know a lot of people have posited that is a potential reason why. Okay. Overall, I think it is safe to say that a lot of people who may not vote regularly, they just have a cynicism about the whole process because they believe their vote won't count. Okay. So we know from survey data that that's the case. So in some sense, yes, overall, for people who talk about voter suppression and how new laws to secure our elections would suppress, minority turnout, the real voter suppression is the lack of confidence in the security of our system because it discourages people to come out simply because they think their vote won't matter. Vis-a-vis any particular policy, I'm not sure that's the case, but overall that seems to be kind of an ongoing theme.
Another question, this might sound funny actually, but is there any policy that you're aware of that would help guarantee the integrity of the electoral process that isn't connected by some people to voter suppression? Are there any policies that are undisputed that this way?
No.
That's fascinating. And
it is, man. I mean, I think, people just toss this phrase voter suppression around so carelessly nowadays. Again, it's done with the intent to prevent any real accountability for the corruption that's taking place in the system. So is there any policy that's going to be mutually agreed upon by everybody as acceptable? No. So it's going to be up to voters to vote in local elected officials who run your elections, who actually care about the sanctity of your vote, who actually believe in that credo of one person, one vote, and they want your vote to count. Because any illegal vote that's count, if there's a double vote that's counted, if there's a vote by an illegal alien that's counted, if there's a dead person that's voted, if they vote for a candidate that's the opposite of who you voted for, they're effectively canceling your vote out. They're canceling your voice. This is a constitutional republic, and we should be able to have a high degree of confidence that everybody's vote counts, everybody's vote matters. That's what this issue is all about. We should be able to know that when we go to those polls that we're participating in a fair, transparent process. And right now, nobody in this country has that safeguard. Nobody can say that because there's so much potential for fraud. A lot of it is documented in this book, and it's something that's easily verifiable. So again, the real question is, how do we get people in office who are going to take this issue seriously and want to create a system whereby they give their constituents confidence that their vote matters, that their voice matters, and that this is a free, fair, and open system. We're supposed to be a beacon of light for the rest of the world in so many areas, but on this issue, we're behind the rest of the world, and we're a bright, shining beacon of corruption. I know a lot of people have fears that people are being disenfranchised in massive numbers. The reason those fears persist is because of, I'm just gonna say it, man, they're just lies that are being told by politicians. They're lies that are being told by activist groups. They're lies being told by media. Again, reference former attorney A.G. Holder's comments. This man is out there telling his constituents that, not his constituents, he was AG, but he's out there telling his audience that voter suppression is the worst it's ever been. This is 2019. He's saying the laws that the GOP is trying to pass, that even some on the left support to make our election stronger, are attempts to suppress the minority vote. That's the equivalent of Joe Biden saying they're gonna put y'all back in chains. It's the same thing.
So what do you say to people that argue, and I think this is a convincing argument, is that when there's too much bureaucracy, too many steps to go through, maybe a bit even like this Mexico example that you gave, people, just don't have the energy in a lot of cases to do it and won't because they're too busy with their lives. Yeah. And so what do you say to that?
I would say that these policies aren't restrictive. They're not repressive. Most people have ID. We need IDs to do everything in life. We need IDs to open a bank account, to get a mortgage, to rent a house, to apply for food stamps. We need ID to donate blood, to get a permit to protest the Orange Man in the White House. We need an ID to do most of anything that we need to do as an adult. Ami Horowitz did a documentary. It's on YouTube, and he interviewed white liberals in UC Berkeley, California, to see what they thought about voter ID laws, and then interviewed black people in Harlem to see what they thought about it. And when he was talking with the people on Berkeley's campus, they all gave these talking points about how black people were less likely to have ID. They're less likely, they said, to be able to have the internet to know where to go to get ID, to have the money to be able to afford ID. It's really patronizing stuff, man.
This is what I was going to say.
It's
or
really
potentially
stuff.
Even a worse word that we hear thrown around a lot.
I'm not going to play that card. Okay. But he interviewed people in Harlem. Mm-hmm. Everybody had ID. Everybody they knew had ID. Everybody said that they would have no problem going to get ID if they didn't have it. And that was the same circumstance with everybody they knew. And they couldn't understand the pathology of those people who thought they were too dumb and too broke to be able to get a driver's license. Interestingly enough, a lot of the people who are saying voter ID laws and meeting some of these burdensome requirements to cast a ballot that sane people are trying to impose, a lot of these same people are the ones saying that black people are able to produce enough paperwork and verification to prove they were slaves to get a reparations check, but we can't figure out how to get a state ID card? It's ridiculous, man. It's absurd, it's patronizing, and most people don't agree with it. It's propaganda. So for the people who, again, I'm just gonna reference this again, 77% of blacks support voter ID laws, 77% Hispanics support voter ID laws, 80% of Americans support voter ID laws. So when you hear these tropes about how difficult it is to, and what a burden it is to produce identification and how people are going to be disenfranchised, and it's just an effort by evil Republicans to suppress the black vote. None of it's true. None of it's true because the data just doesn't check out. It's not there.
Any final words? Anything we didn't cover that you would like to look at?
I mean, I think one of the important takeaways is that with this issue, it's like other issues that we have going on in our culture right now. This is part of a wider war. This is part of an information war, right? And most people's perspectives on this issue are shaped by people who are intentionally misrepresenting information to them, intentionally manipulating them for the sake of their own power. You got to keep in mind who's delivering you what message. Many of the people who are telling you that voter fraud isn't real, that it's not impacting your life, that your vote isn't being canceled out, are the same people who sold you the lie of Russian collusion for the last 3 years. They're the same people who lied to you last January and told you a false story about the Covington Catholic kids. They're the same people who pushed the Jussie Smollett hoax. They're the same people who said that President Trump removed the bust of Martin Luther King from the Oval Office when he didn't. The same people who showed you that edited video from that CNN reporter, I believe, who said that President Trump overfed the fish with Japanese Prime Minister Abe. They've been lying for years. And it's these same people who are pushing these false narratives for the sake of maintaining their own power. This is part of a wider war, it's part of a wider effort, and as soon as people start to see it for what it is, take power that is rightfully theirs, vote people out of office who are corrupt, vote people in who are going to do the right thing and make sure that your vote counts, that's going to be the day that we start to see real change in this country, not only on a local level, but on a national level as well.
Adrian, bottom line is, okay, what would you say to people who will say instituting these policies, all it's going to do is increase the Republican vote?
I mean, if eliminating fraud means all of a sudden one side loses, it means that side was cheating, right? All we're talking about is creating a fair system. All we're talking about is having a system where illegal votes are not part of the equation, and all we're counting are legal registered voters. This should not be controversial at all. This is basic 101 level common sense stuff. So if anybody would get upset over the proposition that we actually have a fair election, I would urge you to kind of rethink your life, man. Like,
Understand.
Rethink what you've been doing and who you've been supporting, because this is all, it shouldn't be, there shouldn't be a lot of pushback when it comes to helping the country live up to its constitutional promise of one person, one vote. All these policies are going to do is guarantee that only legal voters are casting ballots. And in a system that touts free and fair elections in a constitutional republic, that should be the only standard that matters when we're determining what policies we're going to have to enhance the security and integrity of our elections.
Adrian Norman, such a pleasure speaking with you.
You as well. Thanks for having me, man.